That's part of what Jesus is doing. He's saying, imagine you had 100 sheep and you lose one. Wouldn't you leave the 99 and go save the one? And why is he telling him this?
You suck at math?
Welcome back everyone to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're going to take a look at a theist video from over at the channel Reasonable Religion, where this particular theist offers up 8 reasons why he believes his version of God exists. And given that in the title of the video he states that he is a theology professor, which really just means that he professionally teaches about the nature of God and religious belief, but specifically from within the confines of his own denomination's worldview, then he should ostensibly be able to provide some strong justification for why exactly he believes.
Finally, a worthy opponent. Our battle will be legendary!
Now, oftentimes, before I do a response video, I like to do a little background digging so that I can have a better understanding of the person that I'm responding to. The reason I do this is because the information that I find can provide some vital context to what the person is saying, and it ensures that the critiques and arguments that I pose in response specifically address what they believe on their terms instead of what I might mistakenly assume to be their terms.
Never assume. When you assume, you make an asshole out of yourself.
That being said, unfortunately, I was not able to find out much about this creator.
Who are you?
Other than his channel's About section makes the claim that he is an assistant professor of theology, which just means that he hasn't achieved tenure yet and he's basically just a lecturer, and that he vaguely refers to himself as an Orthodox Christian, but doesn't specify exactly which version of Orthodox Christianity he prescribes to out of that very large denominational family. He does claim that he justifies his Orthodox Christianity for 4 reasons. Firstly, that he thinks it's dogmatically sound, which is actually a contradiction in terms because dogmatic, in the context that he is using it, refers to anything communicated via divine or special revelation, which is really just a fancy way of saying the Bible, and then specifically parsed out by the authorities in the church. But sound is a reference to logical structure in which the premises of an argument have been demonstrated to be true, and since the various things purportedly communicated via divine revelation cannot be distinguished from basic sense information-based intuitions that have been influenced by one's own preconceptions, he's therefore begging the question regarding the authority of the church by claiming that his interpretations of his intuitions are sound because the church authorities have confirmed that his interpretations of his intuitions are sound.
That's quite a mouthful.
Secondly, he bases his Orthodox Christianity on it not being limited to the intellectual, which is just a way for him to smuggle in his position that for him, his feelings are equally if not more relevant than facts. Third, that he's met people that he believes have been truly transformed by their God, which is really just another way to say confirmation bias, because if people claim to believe in a God and then adjust their behavior in accordance with that belief, then it totally means that God exists, and in no way could possibly mean that that person simply believes the same thing that he does, and is behaving in a way that he is expecting them to behave. And lastly, and probably the worst reason of all, is because Orthodox Christianity is fully accepting of appealing to mystery, but only when deemed necessary to do so. And I honestly don't think that why that reasoning is objectively the worst needs to be parsed out. So, despite not being able to get more concrete information about this creator, who from here on out I'll just refer to as Professor, I think I did find enough to have at least a decent understanding of the foundation upon which he's going to base his 8 justifications. And hopefully, given his asserted pedigree, they won't be as fallacy-laden as his justifications for why he's an Orthodox Christian were. But to be fair, I'm not going to hold my breath. The floor is yours, Professor.
Welcome to Reasonable Religion. Today I'll be discussing 8 reasons I believe God exists.
Before we go any further in the video, I think it's important to note here that he has established the careful distinction between knowing and believing. This is important because keeping his claims relegated to the category of belief and not biting the bullet by stating that they are knowledge claims allows him to keep the door open for further examination of his justifications. In a sense, it's pretty much the opposite of being dogmatic. He's considering conceding that his beliefs are of a more personal nature and not presenting them as something that he could demonstrate to be the case. While this is the more intellectually honest position to take, it also serves him as one of the many fail-safes that are built into the Christian worldview. Because when anyone ever pushes back on his claims, he can simply retreat to his personal inaccessible internal experience, which of course is something that no one could ever absolutely demonstrate to be false. Basically, he's admitting to, I feel it to be true, so therefore it must be true, and all I could hope to rebut with is, I agree that you're having an experience, but you might be interpreting that experience incorrectly. But I could never show that to absolutely be the case. In the constant philosophical push and pull between believers and non-believers, it's a handy little tactic that serves to protect the theist from persistent external scrutiny by trapping the challenger who pushes too hard on them into making a claim they themselves cannot back up.
Reason number one. One of the things that I've noticed for people who do not believe that God exists is that they define a God in which I don't believe.
Well, that enthusiasm didn't last very long.
You didn't see that coming?
How exactly does referencing the subjective experiences of other people pertain to your own justification? Because what other people don't believe, or how they justify that disbelief, has absolutely no rational bearing on what you do believe and how you justify that belief. Strangely, what you're doing here is making the claim that the version of God that other people don't believe in is not the version of God that actually exists. But in order for that to be the case, you'd actually have to demonstrate that your God is the one that does in fact exist. And you've already conceded prior to making this video that that's something you can't do. So given that this statement is really just a reinforcement of what you already believe, something you conceded that you cannot demonstrate to be the case, how exactly does this track as a justification for your belief?
So, for example, an atheist would say something like, I don't believe in God because God is evil.
Well, that would be a total non sequitur, as holding the position that a God is evil doesn't entail the non-existence of that God. It only negates the possibility of that God having specific attributes. Honestly, Professor, I think what you're doing is misrepresenting the Epicurean trilemma, or the problem of evil. The trilemma works as an internal critique levied against a God with specific attributes, in order to show the logical contradiction between the existence of the omni-God and the existence of evil. Being an internal critique, this works by first granting that a God exists, and then following the logical entailments of its attributes to expose the contradiction with what we observe in reality. And sure, there may be some people out there that do make that mistake. I mean, it's not exactly a grand mystery that people believe strange things for terrible reasons all the time.
I can clearly see you winking.
Damn it, I'm using my left eye?
But someone committing a logical fallacy, especially regarding a conceptualization of a God that you don't personally accept, is in no way a legitimate justification for your own belief.
Well, I don't believe in an evil God either. And if you go to my last video, you'll see exactly why I don't believe in an evil God, and why the God I believe in is necessarily good by definition.
I checked that video that you just mentioned, and yes, it was about the problem of evil. Well, sort of. In that video, you actually failed to address the issue there, because all you did was scapegoat man's asserted free will for the existence of evil, without addressing the logical entailment of your God being the creator of the circumstances that allows for evil to exist in the first place, or how nothing dictated to your God that evil must exist at all, therefore relegating evil to existing necessarily only because your God wants it to exist. So not only was that video just a complete dodge of the trilemma, but it's actually irrelevant to your personal justification in this video, because you don't believe that the conditions that set up the trilemma as a critique apply to your God. So again, how is any of this a justification for your belief? All you've done so far is appeal to what other people don't believe, and then claim that they don't believe for bad reasons, without providing any justification for why you're right and why they're wrong. I'm legitimately curious, Professor, how are you dropping the ball this badly on the first entry on your list?
They might also say something like, God is angry, God is selfish. The truth is, I don't believe in that God either.
And now to do the exact same thing again.
Okay, we get that you think that other people don't believe in your God because they've seemingly defined the God incorrectly. There's really no need to repeat yourself this early in the video.
So it's really important how we define God, and that is the task of theology.
Sure, theology can definitely help you to define a God, but you do have to accept that the definition will be colored by the denominational interpretation of the parameters that set that definition.
You're not God.
Yes, I am, Jesus!
But for the sake of argument, maybe you, Professor, do in fact have an objective definition for what God is. And I would personally love to hear how you justify that definition beyond your own eisegesis.
We often base our definitions of God on our relationships.
Actually, I'm pretty sure you're conflating two things here. People base their definition of what God is on what they've been informed about God by the people around them, and then they adjust that definition as necessary to reconcile the reality they experience in order to stave off the pain of cognitive dissonance. But concluding what the definition of a God is based solely upon the behavior of the people around you is again a non sequitur, because it does not logically follow that just because people can behave like assholes that God is also an asshole. It's also kind of a category error because human behavior is obviously not equivalent to God behavior. And once again, the logical problems in reasoning of other people should hold absolutely no bearing on how you justify your own belief. Are we going to get to your justification anytime soon?
Well, we're waiting.
Or are you just going to waste every single point on your list disparaging the people that don't believe what you believe?
So if I've met many selfish people and the epitome of selflessness is a very low standard in terms of the people I've interacted with, then unfortunately I might think that God himself is selfish, not selfless.
Completely irrelevant. And that is reflected in the operative word there, might. Meaning that it is not always the case that people think that God is selfish because people can be selfish, and then mistakenly believing that that justifies thinking it doesn't exist. But seeing as how we're already a minute into your video, I have to ask, where is your first justification, Professor?
If that is your real name.
If many people I've met in the world are angry, or I've never met somebody who is calm enough or peaceful enough, then perhaps my image of God is skewed.
That's nothing more than a repetition of the irrelevant claim.
So if our definition of God is limited to our experience of others and then reflected back onto the definition of God, we may have an issue and we have to discuss who is the God you're rejecting, who is the God you're accepting.
Great, that can be something that you can establish while you're giving us your first justification for why you believe in it.
The second reason I believe that God exists.
Hang on there, Professor. You didn't actually give a first reason. You just appealed to other people not believing in your God because they somehow mistakenly defined it incorrectly. Not only did you give no justification for why you believe this God exists, but you also gave no justification for why you define your God in a particular way. What, are remedial math courses not required for a doctorate in theology?
Is because of the existence of morality.
Morality in and of itself is just the principles that demarcate between what we identify as right and wrong. These principles, as inferred from our natural capacity for empathy, in no way require the existence of a God to exist themselves. I think what you actually mean here, Professor, is the existence of objective morality. I would say that for a professor, you're being very non-specific, but for a professor of theology, it's completely understandable.
And this is a debate back and forth between atheists and theists or deists. I will pull the professor card here. So I am a professor of theology and I am also specialized in ethics.
And you will respect my authority.
And I have not found a single convincing argument that compels me to think that ethics and morality can exist, or that standards of morality can exist apart from their foundation and grounding in God.
Yes, you're definitely talking about objective morality. Because if morality is entirely subjective, it only needs to be grounded by the individual's personal empathy-based intuition and the overall utility that such frameworks provide to the groups that agree with it. No God required.
Let me be a little bit more precise. You can be moral and you can be ethical without believing in God. You cannot defend those ethical claims. You cannot defend moral claims without belief in God.
Well, that's just absolutely false. Defending subjective morality is easy because one can ground their morality in the evidence provided by the positively selected traits that provide our species' population with a capacity for empathy. That capacity for empathy works as a phenomenal survival trait and thus was selected naturally and to an extent artificially throughout our population's ongoing evolution. And the fact that empathy presents as a spectrum and not a universal standard equal amongst all humans is further evidence that the moral frameworks we individually and societally ground using that empathetic intuition are also subjectively derived and applied. And seeing as how I myself am a moral relativist, your assertion that objective morality exists is not a problem that I have to contend with. Also, it has to be pointed out that the existence or non-existence of what we would call objective morality in no way entails that a God does or does not exist, as those are two separate claims. The only reason they don't appear separate to you or your particular particular brand of Christianity, Professor, is because of the multitude of assumptions you make about the nature of this God based on the unverifiable claims in your version of the Bible and your personal intuitions about what the nature of this entity must be so that the world can continue to make sense to you. You have, however, taken an even further step. You basically claim that morality is objective because it comes from your God. But you've completely missed, or flatly ignored, a major issue logically entailed by the category in which your God sits. You define your God as a mind, and that nothing exists external to it that it must necessarily reference to decree what anything, let alone morality, must or must not specifically be. For something to be objective, it must necessarily be mind independent. And since your God is definitionally a mind, and nothing exists external to it to influence its stance in any direction, then it is logically entailed that any possible moral framework that this entity decrees is necessarily mind dependent. And seeing as how it would also be a category error to claim that what your God's nature entails is equivalent to what is entailed by what we perceive to be human nature, you must either concede that any morality that your God could lay down is necessarily subjective, or redefine the God category to address something that exists in the hierarchy above it that constrains its actions, or abandon your top-down thinking, head back to square one, and start reasoning rationally from the bottom up.
So it is their defense. It is saying that one thing is better than another.
That's correct. And while basing such a position solely upon your emotions wouldn't be the best defense, basing it on the evidence afforded by the positive utility of an agreed upon moral framework would certainly be sufficient. But sadly, Professor, you are once again ignoring a glaring issue in your own worldview. Because your notion of what you perceive to be objective morality is faith-based, meaning it's based upon what you eisegetically infer about your God from your version of the Bible, and you cannot demonstrate that what you are inferring is actually the case, then you attacking atheists for somehow being unable to sufficiently defend their subjective morality is just a variant of the tu quo que fallacy that we call whataboutism. Also, it has to be said that the inability to provide a sufficient defense for a particular position is in no way evidence that a God exists. So your appeal to your faith-based morality is really just a red herring to distract from the fact that you don't have real justification either. At the bare minimum, at least the atheist can appeal to the mountains of evidence collected over centuries of work in biology, psychology, and sociology, because unlike your God, humans actually exist to collect evidence from.
It is a hierarchy of values that cannot be achieved without belief in God.
Also false. Values are, of course, subjective to the individual. And hierarchies of values are expressed in the hierarchies of societies. You have the values of the individual, the group, the state, the nation, and the world. How those hierarchies are interpreted and applied are, of course, also completely subjective. But just because they're subjective does not mean that all of a sudden they don't exist.
And since I do believe there is a moral standard and there are moral maxims, I do believe in God.
You may have worded that wrong, Professor, because as you worded it, it's another non sequitur. It does not logically follow that because a person believes in moral standards that a God exists. So all you've actually done here is invoke your equally indefensible moral standard as a red herring to dodge addressing another justification for why you believe. That's 2 down, Professor, and so far, you're batting 0.
Reasons number 3 and 4 collapse into one title, which is that atheism requires faith.
Really, man? You gotta know that this is gonna work out for you about as well as it worked out for Frank Turek, right?
You probably heard this before, but one area where atheism requires faith is that if I am an atheist, I must believe that all things that have been created were created from nothing by nothing.
Okay, that doesn't even make sense for a whole host of reasons. First off, it's a non sequitur. Being an atheist does not logically entail believing that everything was created from nothing by nothing. Second, it's a false dichotomy. Everything from a god or everything from nothing are not the only 2 available options. Everything that exists now being the result of a series of non-agential prior causes is completely possible. And just to cover all the bases, I don't know is a perfectly valid answer. Third, what you said is logically contradictory, because if all you have is a philosophical nothing, then nothing can come from that because matter is a result of work. And if there's nothing to do work, then matter cannot form. And a philosophical nothing cannot be an agent that creates. What you've done here, Professor, is present 2 disparate concepts, atheism and cosmology, as somehow being fundamentally intertwined with each other, as though a position in one necessitates a position in the other. But atheism itself does not make cosmological claims, and cosmology doesn't make claims about the existence existence or non-existence of a god or gods. I gotta say, dude, I really hope you're not trying to pass this kind of nonsense off to your students, because if you are setting them up for some truly catastrophic failures in the future.
I think it's much more probable that all things that we see are created by somebody, even if it's out of nothing.
Now, what would be the odds of that?
But it doesn't matter what you think is probable, Professor, especially when you're deriving that probability off of the assumption that your God exists. It's the exact same failure that was expressed in Pascal's wager, because Pascal based that argument on the assumption that only his God could possibly exist. Being that this is essentially a math question, what actually matters is if you can prove the probability of such an event, which you obviously can't do, because you can't even demonstrate that the God you think exists actually exists in order to derive a probability from.
You cannot experimentally reproduce something being created out of nothing.
Well, if you were talking about a philosophical nothing, then yes, you'd be correct. But as far as we can tell, such a state does not and cannot exist due to the first law of thermodynamics. Energy exists, and as far as we can tell, has always existed even in the vacuum. However, we have demonstrated that virtual particles can spontaneously appear out of and disappear back into the vacuum via the Casimir effect.
And if you go, there are experiments in which they put things into vacuums, although vacuums are not nothing, to see if there would be any spontaneous combustion or existence of particles.
Okay, Professor, now I'm really starting to think that you have no idea what you're talking about. Combustion is an exothermic reaction between a fuel source and an oxidant.
Bada boom.
Which means combustion cannot happen in a vacuum, given, the lack of an oxidant in that state. So no one who actually understands these fields would ever expect to see combustion in a vacuum. I'm always confused when theists think that attacking science is equivalent to attacking atheism or justifying their belief in a god. Because even if we didn't observe something like the Casimir effect, it certainly wouldn't be evidence that a god exists.
You cannot reproduce something coming into existence out of nothing.
Correct, but I already addressed that as far as we can tell, a philosophical nothing is not a thing that can exist.
And in any case, you cannot reproduce the creation of the universe.
Okay, saying that we humans cannot experimentally reproduce the conditions that gave rise to the universe does not mean in any way that we can never know what those conditions are. That statement is akin to flat earthers claiming that the gravity of the earth isn't true because we can't experimentally reproduce the gravity of the earth. It's like saying propositions that are backed by mountains of evidence and math and predictive modeling are somehow completely insufficient. Knowledge is not predicated solely upon scientific experimentation, and knowledge doesn't have to be absolute to be knowledge. This is one of the major reasons why you constantly hear atheists asking for evidence, because with sufficient evidence we can then generate explanatory models that make predictions, and if those predictions come true, we then know that the model we've created is accurate to a degree and we can continue working from there.
Yes, science!
So to say that it is scientifically invalid to be religious, or that if you are not religious then you believe in science, is not quite accurate, because there are gaps in the logic and gaps in the scientific evidence, and the creation of the universe is certainly one of those.
As I stated before, being an atheist does not automatically commit someone to any cosmological positions. And yes, there are gaps in our knowledge when it comes to some aspects of cosmology. While we do have some strong working hypotheses, ultimately we don't have concrete answers yet. And for the answers that we don't currently have, we can simply concede that we don't know, and that is perfectly valid. Because not knowing does not entail that a god does or does not exist. You, however, do claim that the answer is absolutely your god. But you cannot demonstrate that claim to be true beyond your own faith position. So, while I do not think it was what you intended to convey here, I would like to thank you for acknowledging your own God of the Gaps fallacy, inadvertent as it was.
The fourth point, which is a subpoint of atheism requiring faith, is that the universe has order, beauty, organization. And the second law of thermodynamics states that entropy tends to increase within a system. Entropy here is disorder, disorganization, chaos.
Okay, now I know you have no idea what you're talking about. First, because concepts like order, beauty, and organization have nothing to do with the second law of thermodynamics. Order is just referring to the descriptive and quantitative languages of logic and mathematics. Beauty is an entirely subjective standard of evaluation of objects in the universe, and while some may argue that it's one of the 5 transcendentals, I argue that it's just humans imposing their own personally appealing aesthetic standard upon the universe, and then fallaciously assuming it's something prescriptive of the universe. And organization is again kind of referring to logic and mathematics, although more obliquely. And what you just described, Professor, is not what the second law of thermodynamics describes. At the origin point of observability, what many people call the Big Bang, the work possible was extremely high and the entropy very low. And when the universe reaches thermal equilibrium, septillions of years from now, work will become impossible, because things will be so spread out that nothing will be able to interact with anything else, and thus entropy will be at its highest. Though terms like disorganization and chaos may to a degree seem aesthetically synonymous, when theists use these terms in regards to physics, they're completely misleading, because in the theistic context, those terms come front-loaded with the assumption that something exists to secure organization and order. To be completely blunt, Professor, you can't even represent these fields correctly, because you yourself are not a physicist or a cosmologist, and until you are properly certified to teach these subjects, you really have no business even referencing them, let alone teaching them to students.
So left to its own, it doesn't make any sense that the world would be created the way in which it was.
That is also incorrect, and I assume that he's making that mistake because he's not entirely familiar with Hume's Epicurean hypothesis, which is where Hume argued that given the vast timescales of the universe, the seemingly random and chaotic motion of the particles as initiated by the inflation event could absolutely give way to complex and ordered systems by way of the natural forces, without the need of an intelligent designer as an explanation. Regardless, Professor, because you can't show any logical contradiction being entailed by that proposition, it renders what you said here as nothing more than an argument from incredulity.
If anything, the creation of the universe should have led to further chaos, not further organization. It is clear that there is an order, that there is not increasing chaos.
Yeah, there isn't increasing chaos. It's increasing entropy. Please, I beg you, learn basic physics before you try and talk about it.
If I were to pick up a watch on the street, I wouldn't say it is incredible how this watch came together spontaneously and tended to come into this organization out of non-organization on its own. I would say it's a really nice watch made by a watchmaker. Same argument applies to the universe, to the world.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
I honestly don't know how many times I've addressed the watchmaker fallacy before, but I do know it's quite a bit, so I'm not going to dive into it here. Suffice it to say, the universe and a pocket watch are simply not analogous.
I am much more convinced that the order of the world was created by a person rather than completely by chance. The probability of the latter is very unstatistical.
First, Professor, that is again an argument from incredulity. And second, no, as far as the evidence goes, the probability is 100%, given that we have access to one universe to test and no sufficient evidence to support a God claim.
And then my estimation would require a great deal of faith.
It certainly does for you, but not for the atheist, because the atheist position does not commit the atheist to any cosmological positions whatsoever. Remember, Professor, while an atheist may support their atheist position with an understanding of science, atheism itself is not predicated upon that understanding, and that is because it is only predicated on not being convinced of the truth of the God claim. And given that pretty much the entirety of your third and fourth points were nothing more than a misunderstanding and misapplication of science, a misrepresentation of the relationship between science and atheism, and arguments from incredulity, you're now 0 for 4 in the justification department.
Point number 5. If I were not to believe in God, then I would necessarily have to believe that every single person who has ever had any religious notion from the existence of the universe until this point in time were absolutely wrong on all religious accounts.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
And there you go with another non sequitur. Just when I thought your arguments couldn't possibly get any worse, you go and completely subvert my expectations. Atheism pertains to not believing in the existence of a god or gods.
It's quite simple, really.
Every other possible religious claim is completely separate from the God claims. While it is logically possible that every single religious notion that every single human has ever had throughout all of human history is in fact wrong, and could simply be the result of things like type 1 and type 2 errors as a result of pareidolia and apophenia, which, by the way, is a hypothesis that is backed by mountains of evidence. None of that is what atheism itself is addressing.
So the fact that there are many religions across human history, more likely than not, points points to the existence of a god.
No, it doesn't. That's just an argumentum ad populum. Propositions are either true or not true. That is a true dichotomy. The amount of people that happen to believe that a proposition is true has not only zero bearing on the impossibility or possibility of a proposition's truth or falsity, but it also has zero effect on the probability of that proposition's being true or not true.
Someone might respond and say, well, religion across history has just been a coping mechanism for the difficulties of the universe.
Well, sure, that's one way you could put it. And yes, religious concepts are often used as coping mechanisms by people to stave off the cognitive dissonance created by phenomena they can't readily reconcile. But I personally feel that that statement is overly reductive, because it ignores the obvious social utilities that religious notions have provided humans over the past 200,000 years. But you have to remember, Professor, just because a conceptualization has a positive utility does not negate the possible negative consequences of that conceptualization, nor does it demonstrate that the conceptualization exists in reality.
And it doesn't seem like that's always the case. It doesn't explain all religious practices. It doesn't explain all religious experiences.
Sure, it doesn't explain everything, which is why I said that while true of the part, it is not necessarily true of the whole. And for you to assume that it is would be a very reductive composition fallacy.
Humans by nature are never entirely satisfied.
Okay, well that's a pretty vague claim about human psychology. And given that the concept of satisfaction looks different to virtually every single human being on this planet, you could never hope to demonstrate that that claim was true. I know that you're probably basing that claim on the identified phenomena in human psychology, that human beings appear to inherently require a meaning or purpose for themselves as a function of healthy self-actualization, but outright claiming that a human being could never be satisfied is honestly just straight up stupid. Not to mention kind of demeaning when you really think about what that statement implies about how you perceive non-believers. But even if we were to grant that that was the case, it still wouldn't be a justification for believing that a god or gods exists. Just because a person may choose to fill that seeming void in their identity with the concept of a god in no way entails that that god exists.
We're seeking for something that fulfills us that is outside of us. That thing, that person is God.
If true, that thing could be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be a god. For that to be true, you would have to demonstrate how that standard is something that applies equally to all humans. Beyond that, it's just a claim you're making based upon your personal experience. Just because something feels true to you does not mean it feels true to everybody else. This is part of the beauty of being able to freely choose, to go out into the world, do the work, self-reflect, and find the meaning for yourself, to find the thing that fulfills you in your life. And if you eventually find that that thing falls short, go out, do it again, and find something else. Because as I often say, a purpose chosen by oneself is infinitely more valuable than a purpose dictated by someone else. You're now 0 for 5, Professor, not looking too good.
Point number 6, I alluded to earlier. One thing I notice in the debate between those who are religious and those who are non-religious is that those who are non-religious will say that I believe in science. I believe only in what I see and what I experience.
That's a bold statement.
Again, I'm pretty sure that this is another major issue with how the professor is conveying the information, because either he's totally lying and using a false dichotomy of faith and empiricism to support that lie, or the sample size of non-believers that he's spoken with in the past is so incredibly small that he's deriving a false conclusion from the limited data set, or he's just misrepresenting atheism because he fundamentally doesn't understand what it is. And given the shockingly low quality of his points thus far, and the enormous amount of logical mistakes and misrepresentations he's already made, all 3 of those are entirely possible. Obviously, being an atheist does not automatically commit someone strictly to empiricism. There are many things that we know exist in reality that we have never directly seen with just our eyes. This is again why evidence that sufficiently supports the proposition of existence is so critically important. And it's why the rigorous and precise scientific method, a methodology by the way that humans have been steadily refining for thousands of years, is such a fantastic way to increase the probability of likelihood of a given proposition. While systems of faith appeal solely to one's feelings to try and justify believing a proposition to be true. So Professor, regardless if you're lying, misinformed, or just plain ignorant, this is just one more non sequitur.
First of all, science and religion are entirely compatible. There's nothing that has been discovered in science that is contradictory, at least to the Christian faith?
Well, that's really up for debate, because it not only depends on what all you're including in the set of the Christian faith, but also which particular denomination of Christianity you're addressing. Some denominations readily accept evidence and then adjust their worldviews accordingly, usually while silently pushing their God closer and closer to the edge of the board. But some of them interpret the Bible so literally that they essentially wind up completely denying reality. If your Christian faith set includes things like the inerrancy of the Bible or the efficacy of prayer, then science has absolutely debunked those things 100 times over. But if you limit the set to something like the resurrection, while scientific endeavors today cannot directly debunk an event that purportedly happened 2 millennia ago, they can indicate why such an event appears to be impossible, and that holding to the belief that such an event took place in the past despite no good evidence to support it ever happening would be irrational. And that's because in the process of explaining phenomena, science relies wholly upon evidence, not faith. So we at minimum do know that the methodologies each field uses to get closer to the truth are incompatible.
Second of all, nobody entirely believes only in what they sense, in what they see, in what there is evidence for.
I can't believe you can lie like that.
Well, that is an outright falsehood. I know that because I myself only believe in things that have been sufficiently demonstrated to be true. And those beliefs are not limited to only what I can sense with my physical senses. They are, however, limited by the amount of evidence that supports them.
Easy example is love. Everybody believes in love. You've experienced love. Love is beyond words. Love is beyond comprehension. Love is beyond the molecular level.
Love is a many splendid thing. Love lifts us up where we belong. All you need is love.
Those are some pretty hefty claims there, sir. First, while I myself have never met a person who doesn't believe that love is a thing that exists, I have met many people who are inclined to think of love as something more than what it actually is, primarily due to the potency of its effects on the human experience. Biologically speaking, what we call love is just an umbrella term we give to the intense feelings we get from the presence of a combination of hormones, which includes the likes of oxytocin, norepinephrine, dopamine, vasopressin, serotonin, and many others. The evidence indicates that the presence of these hormones have profound effects on emotional states, and this has led humans to conceptualize the emotion in extremely poetic ways, sometimes to the degree that love itself is somehow transcendent of the universe. But back in reality, and to put it quite simply, that's just how high your brain is getting off of those hormones. It's a naturally occurring chemical process that induces intense emotional states, a process no different from dimethyltryptamine or psilocybin.
You wouldn't say that my experience of love is simply the release of endorphins.
No, I wouldn't, because endorphins are a group of hormones that are produced by the pituitary gland and play a role in reducing pain perception and increasing a general sense of well-being. If you're familiar with the term runner's high, then you are familiar with the effects of endorphins. The hormones behind what we call love come from far different places and have far different effects. So no, I wouldn't say that love is just the presence of endorphins, because then we would both be wrong.
The result of my loving somebody might end in the release of endorphins. The release of endorphins is not what causes me to love somebody.
Well, at least you're correct on that one statement. It's not the release of endorphins, it's the release of hormones.
There may be some level of attraction and level of chemistry, as they call it, something on the molecular level. It is common human experience that the experience of love between family, between friends, between spouses goes well beyond something that we can simply explain by the release of certain chemicals in the body.
While I completely agree that sometimes feelings can be so intense to the point of overwhelming rationality, the intensity of those feelings is in no way evidence that love is anything more than chemical interactions within the brain. In this instance, Professor, what you are doing is giving more validity to your personal feelings than you are to what you have actual evidence for.
So we don't just believe in what we experience with our 5 senses.
Technically, there are more than just 5 senses. And no, every perception you have, even your feelings, are a result of some form of stimuli. Even if that stimuli is just your brain interpreting patterns out of the randomness that you are observing, or simply listening to a person talk, or reading from the book about the experiences of others. All of that stimuli informs your central nervous system. The question you have to ask after the stimuli is experienced is, am I interpreting the stimuli honestly and accurately? If there is no stimuli at all, then there is no information for your brain to process, and therefore there would be no experience for you to internalize. To put it in its most simplistic simplistic terms, you can't know what you can't know.
There's an experience beyond that which we're able to articulate.
Sure, sometimes your emotions are so intense that they override your ability to communicate those emotions effectively. That just means that the emotional experience is overwhelming your rational thought. It does not mean that things like love exist beyond what they are at the biological level.
Point number 7, humans are distinct. We have a consciousness that is distinct about us. We're able to think abstractly. We are aware of our existence. We're able to take ourselves outside of our existence for a second and reflect on our existence.
Did you ever find Bugs Bunny attractive when he'd put on a dress and play a girl bunny? No. Neither did I. I was just asking.
Well, those are just things that describe humans and what humans do. The individuality of genetic and psychological presentation in humans is in no way evidence of a god, and would certainly not be a justification for believing one existed.
We have an inherent sense of the divine and the supernatural, which I mentioned previously in this video.
That would be a contradiction, because that which is divine or supernatural is definitionally outside of nature. If human beings are able to sense something with their bodies, then whatever they are sensing has a natural aspect to it. And if something is embedded in nature to a degree that we can sense it, then definitionally it cannot be supernatural or divine. Now what humans do have is an extremely evolved ability to assign values to patterns that we've picked out of randomness, and then a propensity to assign a divine or supernatural value to those patterns when we can't readily explain them by naturalistic means. We do this because evolutionarily speaking, our brains don't like unknowns.
Somebody tell me! Do you hear me? Somebody tell me how he did it! I have to know!
Because unknowns present potential threats to our continued survival. So our brains have the evolved tendency to try and close that gap with whatever it can, even if that means assigning explanatory values that we have completely made up. These are, of course, errors that served us very well in surviving through our more primitive years, but really don't serve us anymore today beyond creating unnecessary societal divides.
And the most interesting distinction, and it may be attributed to our freedom, being created in the image and likeness of God within the Christian tradition,
yet another positive claim that you cannot back up,
is that humans are able to act in contradiction to their own flourishing, against their own nature.
And another profoundly incorrect statement. Anything an organism is capable of is included in its nature.
It's in your nature to destroy yourselves.
Yeah. Nature drag, huh?
And anything that it cannot be capable of is outside of its nature. Flying by means of biology alone is outside of human nature. But building things like tools that help us to fly is completely within our nature. Creating, destroying, or doing absolutely nothing is also within our nature. While the reasons why humans do what they do is dependent upon an infinite number of possible variables, to state that humans uniquely have the ability to act against their own self-interest is false, because we have documented both sacrificial and self-terminating behavior throughout the animal kingdom. And that human beings can act against their own self-interest is of course not a justification to believe in a god.
This is not a trivial point. Dogs must be dogs. Lions must be lions. All the rest of creation, trees, must be trees.
And humans must be humans. It is a fairly simple concept that you are applying way too much value to, Professor. And you're likely doing it so that you can justify your position that human beings are somehow uniquely special amongst all the other species on the planet. Therefore justifying your belief that we humans are somehow specially made by God. But of course it all falls apart if you cannot demonstrate your God to exist.
Humans do not necessarily have to be human. We do not have to do that which is good for our flourishing. We can act contrary to our nature, to our own detriment.
So yeah, this is just a fundamental misunderstanding or deliberate misrepresentation of what exactly constitutes an organism's nature. If humans have the capacity to act against their own self-interest, then it is included in the set of things that are in human nature. Just because some of those things appear to be atypical, it doesn't mean those atypical things are not a part of it.
This is an unfortunate reality, but it is also part and parcel of our God-given freedom.
Yeah, that just assumes the God exists to bestow to humans what we perceive as free will. You're 0 for 7, Professor. You've got one more shot to connect with something, or we're sending you back to the miners for training.
Lastly, point number 8, I believe in God because I have seen those who have experienced God, who have been transformed by God, and who carry God in themselves.
Oh, swing and a miss.
Well, better luck next year.
No, Professor. What you have actually seen are people who have been convinced to believe the same thing that you believe. and then behaving in the fashion that you would expect them to behave. That's not divine transformation. That's just plain old confirmation bias.
There's no way to encounter a person who has been truly transformed by God and still have doubt as to his existence.
Well, Professor, that would presume that there is a method to determine the difference between a person who is truly transformed by a divine entity and a person who has simply altered their behavior because they have been convinced a particular proposition is true. And seeing as how no methodology exists to do that, any person that you could possibly point to as evidence for your claim would be indistinguishable from confirmation bias. And any unbeliever who wasn't convinced that the person was transformed by a supernatural deity would just push you towards claiming that the unbeliever was dishonestly denying it, which you can't demonstrate, or that the believer wasn't truly transformed regardless of what they personally think, which would be a no true Scotsman fallacy. Everywhere you turn, Professor, your faith has built-in fail-safes to protect you from critical challenges. And if you yourself had been critical in your initial evaluation, that would have been the first sign that something about your faith system doesn't jive. And that will conclude the professor's list of reasons why he believes in God.
Thank Christ.
The problem is, however, instead of actual justifications for his belief, it's really just a list of the numerous logical fallacies he's committing, buried under a mountain of willfully ignorant prevarication. I will also say this. While there are theists that exist in this world that will behave in the manner the professor did as a sort of predatory tactic, specifically targeting individuals who don't have the level of experience they do in recognizing these sorts of logical gaffes, and those individuals should definitely be called out at every single opportunity, I personally don't get the vibe that the professor is one of those kinds of individuals. I came away from his video thinking that he honestly believes that what he is saying here is absolutely clear and coherent. And whether it's a choice made out of willful obstinance, apathy, or even fear, I think he simply hasn't been exposed to the vast majority of this kind of information. But even if he was, critical examination swings both ways. One must be willing, even eager, to put their own beliefs on the chopping block to ensure that what they believe is as close to the truth as possible and therefore rationally justified. Calling out these kinds of logical errors, as readily with oneself as with others, is what keeps us intellectually honest and constantly improving our positions. And I personally think that one of the best ways to bridge the divide is by demonstrating to those individuals that hold opposing positions to yours that, as ready and willing as you expect them to be in challenging their own positions, you are equally prepared and willing to challenge your own. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, December is HIV/AIDS Awareness Month. A link on how you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you love scary movies, be sure to check out me and my filmmaker friends over at the Week in Horror podcast, now in our 5th season. Everything you need to become a channel member here, get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear, get an official Darth, Dawkins, Squeak toy, or support the podcast is down in the description. Once again, I thank each and every single one of you for your continued support. I hope you have a wonderful holiday, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together, we can bridge the divide.